All right, Sibel, many thanks. Thanks everybody for showing up on a summer Thursday to talk about the metaverse. Really excited today to introduce our speaker. She is the head of the multiverse design, which is which Leah Zaidi, who is garbled today. Her focus is on basically world building and futurism. She's consulted for many Fortune 100 companies, and she's also advising two countries at the moment, Finland and Canada, and how to think about sort of these emerging technologies, these emerging spaces. We've all been seeing a lot of these new innovations in AR and XR and all these interesting spaces and technologies coming together, things around decentralization, things around metaverse, a lot of hype, a lot of talk, a lot of products, a lot to sift through. And I know Leah's spent a lot of time thinking about these things, thinking about how we can qualify these different metaverses, how we can envision the future. And I'm particularly very excited to welcome her today to see this presentation and to have a great conversation. So as always, if you have questions as we're going along, just throw them in the Q&A. I will prioritize your questions over my own. And Leah, take it away.
Sure, thank you. I'm really excited to present this to you today. This is a bit of a labor of love. It takes a long time to produce the scenarios that I'm going to be sharing with you. So I hope that you enjoy them. And while I get set up, if you have any initial questions related to the metaverse, feel free to throw them in the chat. So today we're going to be talking about simulating the future. And this is a report that Jesse Damiani and I put out earlier this year. We released it at South by Southwest. And essentially it contains a bunch of scenarios that we think could potentially happen in relation to the metaverse. We're going to go through what the metaverse is. We're going to talk a little bit about the scenarios that we've created, our take on the metaverse, and how we position ourselves in the definition that we're using, how we created our scenarios. So I'll show you my strategic world building process so that you can do it too, and why this method is important, especially for tech workers and companies. And then finally, we'll get to the scenarios themselves, and I'll walk you through what we've done in the past and then what we are considering seeing emerging now. So the metaverse is misunderstood. This is a hot button topic. Everybody has an opinion on this, and most of the opinions are negative if you talk to the mainstream. But the current conversation is really full of noise and a lot of nonsense information. So we don't necessarily have a good conversation going, partly because we can't separate those signals and noises. I would say about 90% of the information, maybe even more, out there right now, positive and negative, is probably not useful. It's not getting to the heart of the matter. It's not getting to the real potential use cases that we're seeing emerging. And it's not doing a good job of communicating what the potential of this technology is as it impacts our day-to-day life. And part of that is because, some stakeholders in the space have come out and put their stake in the ground and said, we think the metaverse is this. When we're talking about the metaverse, we're not really talking about this paint version of a virtual world that you kind of go into and spend time in. What we're actually talking about is more of this. So on the left here, what you have is a set of glasses from a company called XR.AI. And this set of glasses, far from being just an augmented reality glass, is about helping people with disabilities be able to communicate and participate in conversations they're having around them. So if you have a hearing impairment, these glasses essentially create a simulation that runs across your eyes and allows you to read what's happening. So it's picking up on people's lips and what they're saying, and the audio, and converting that into a version that someone with a hearing disability can read. And then on the right over here, we have a whole combination of metaverse technologies for firefighting. So it's a combination of real-time rendering, AI, internet, and also an augmented reality glass. And essentially what it does is that it uploads the floor plans of a particular place for firefighters as the fire is raging. And when they go in, they're able to kind of see through the fire. If you think about how the world is changing and some of the things that are emerging, things like wildfires. I'm in Canada right now. We are dealing with this problem. This is potentially life-saving. We're talking about shaving 15 to 20 seconds off of a incident, and that means the difference between life and death, essentially. So this isn't, just about escaping into virtual worlds. This is about looking for applications that have significant impact on the systems that we're operating in, our day-to-day lives, and potentially, the challenges that we're going to be facing in the future. And so what is the metaverse? What are we really talking about here? So Jesse and I laid down some definitions. We took a look at what others that we think are experts in the field are saying, and we kind of extracted what we think the metaverse is really about. So part of it is the creation and manipulation of virtual atoms. So we're talking about 3D simulation-based internet. I've also seen the term immersive internet emerge, which I think is a good term too. It's emergent technologies and practices that inform the rise of a persistent spatial internet. It's also the fastest way to get kicked out of a dinner party right now. So not a fun topic for a lot of people, but I do think it's an important one. And part of the reason why there's so much confusion right now is because this is a long arc. The metaverse is really a long arc. So if we want to compare, something like 3D internet or immersive internet to something that's a bit more analogous, we want to look at something like mobile internet, right? The previous evolution of the internet that allowed us to go from these jobs that we're sitting at out into the world. So in terms of mobile internet, you can kind of see here on this timeline that we've laid out that it took a long time to develop this technology and get to where we are. So we saw Motorola in 1973 release the cell phone. We saw the official birth of the internet happen about 10 years later. Then Nokia came in with a phone that had the internet on it. I'm going to give away my age right now, but I had one of those Nokia brick phones when I was a teenager. Those things were indestructible. And that was my introduction to the internet and having a cell phone. And then BlackBerry, that was probably the first phone where I actually used the internet on. And then of course we had the iPhone and the release of that as a hallmark. And that's the closest, that's really the phone that kind of got us closest to the smartphone and where we are now. What I want you to notice here is a couple of things. So first, we've got a confluence of technologies happening that weren't necessarily developed together, but that converge to get us to where we are. And two, that the major innovators in the space are no longer the dominant players. So if you look at the fact that Motorola, Nokia, and BlackBerry are probably not the phones that you have today. If I were to do a quick poll of the audience and ask, what phone are you using? You're probably going to say Samsung or Apple, most likely, and then there'll be a few others. But these three might not come up at all. No one might have a Motorola, Nokia, or BlackBerry. And yet these were the innovators in the field. These were the organizations that did the research, put up the money, and paved the way for others to come about. And so if we compare that to the metaverse, we're probably about here-ish. It's really hard to estimate where we would be in a similar timeline because the technology is different, the challenges are different, but essentially we're not at maturity. Again, this is a long arc. We're talking potentially decades. So if it takes decades to develop something like cell phone technology, with the internet and have mobile internet, essentially, it could take a while to get 3D internet and to get immersive internet and really see the real use cases emerge over time. We're already starting to see them, but it could be a while longer. And so the key to really understanding as lay people outside of the people who are building the tech, what the metaverse is really to focus on the use cases and the affordances. What does this allow us to do that maybe desktop and mobile don't allow us to do? What are the opportunities that this is going to potentially create for the average person? What is this going to create in our critical systems? So we want to look at that. We don't want to be focused on things like false starts, missteps, and false experiments, the things that kind of go wrong along the way. A lot of people have made a fuss about the fact that, Meta has laid off people or other organizations have laid off people related to the metaverse. And that's a surefire sign that the metaverse is dead. It's not. When you're talking about a long arc, there are many ebbs and flows. There are going to be new players in the field that might come up someday as well. And if you think that the dominant players can't take a hit, I'm just going to remind you that in the past year, we've seen ChatGPT really take off and scare Google a little bit. And Google had search on lockdown. It was really hard to compete with them. So we can see how things shift. We can see how disruptive players come about. We can see how technology can kind of converge over time, and we can see how there's shifts in power as that goes along. So that's kind of what we want to focus on, and then really look at what the technology can do, not the first applications, but the underlying potential of it, and then go from there in terms of how it could potentially be used in the future. And this is kind of what we do. We look at potential emerging realities as they relate to many different challenges and many different technologies. And part of that is, anticipating and designing those emerging possibilities using a process called strategic world building. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. Strategic world building is essentially a combination of future thinking, systems thinking, and narrative design. So future thinking is really not about forecasting, which is like prediction. It's about possibilities. And so what we do is we focus on the many possibilities that might emerge. And then once we think about the many possibilities, we work backwards to think about what is possible today as a result of those scenarios that emerge. And then with systems thinking, we're looking at complex challenges, potentially wicked problems, things that don't have an easy solution. And we're focusing in on how the different components of that interact with each other and offset each other. And with narrative design, we want to anticipate how things could branch off. So narrative design comes out of gaming. It's the pathways that is created for the character to play along. And sometimes those storylines can branch quite significantly. So a narrative designer is the person who creates all those steps and then controls the narrative and allows you to have a seamless play experience. So that's what strategic world building is. And the scenarios that you're going to see soon are going to reflect this process. And it's really based on this model that I created. So this is the 7 foundations of world building model. Essentially, what I think is that every significant system, every organization, culture has 7 components to it at a fundamental level. And these 7 components play off of each other in weird and interesting ways. We've seen this with COVID, the political stances around it, the stories that emerged, the aesthetics and symbols of the masks, the environmental damage that happened from the masks being thrown out. This is something that you can kind of apply to a lot of different problems, and we applied it here in talking about the metaverse. And the overall process that we use to come up with our scenarios is that we started with anticipated changes and disruptions, so what we call signals of change. And signals are these sort of fringe data points that exist that tell us that, if this one thing, if this one weird little incident or event or company were to scale and become very disruptive, how might that change the future? And so we looked at the implications of those signals. And then we considered what the implications could be if they formulated scenarios of the future. And then this next step is not in the report that we released. This is kind of like the work that you have to do by company. It's the strategy work. And what we ultimately would do is we would use the scenarios to think through, well, if this were to happen, how do we position ourselves now? And so this method matters because change and disruption are difficult to anticipate, but we can think through some of those use cases and the affordances ahead of time. We want to create spaces that engage multiple perspectives, points of view, wisdom, where it's safe to challenge assumptions as well. So we want to take many things in the system into account and include many voices in the process. We also believe that reality is socially constructed. A lot of what we call reality is actually fiction. So the idea of countries and money, these things that we sort of take for granted are really stories that we're telling. There's no real line in the ground that delineates where one country starts and where another ends. A lot of people in the US got mad at Canada recently because of the wildfires. And this is one of those instances of climate change being global and not paying attention to the lines that we've drawn, because those are things that we've created borders. So the planet's not really concerned with the borders that we've created. But that's what we mean when we're talking about how a lot of reality is fiction. And so breaking it down and deconstructing it and thinking about how to take those components and build up is critical. And then that all leads us to doing data-driven storytelling. So, when we create scenarios, we create evidence-based work. We don't want to do things where we're just kind of pulling things out of the air, or we're going into a sci-fi kind of angle where we're trying to pull out like what would be cool and interesting. What we want to do is take the evidence and then present the evidence in a way that's compelling and a bit narrative driven. The reason why we do that is because we are really attached to stories. Stories matter to us as people, and the way information is processed is different when it's told to us in the form of a story as opposed to just facts. And so our track record so far has been pretty good. In 2021, we released was it 2021? 2022, sorry, I'm losing track of time. In 2022, we released a report called Portals, and that was our first Metaverse report. And we included a bunch of scenarios in there that happened. So I'm just going to show you 3 of them now. The first was avatar dysmorphia. We said that because people are able to create these really beautiful versions of themselves in virtual worlds, that there might be a potential effect on things like plastic surgery, where people are going in and requesting to look more like their avatar. We've already seen this happen with filters on Instagram and in other places. So we kind of saw that this could be a potential thing that might come up. And it happened a few months after we released the report. There was an incident of a woman who got plastic surgery to look a little bit more like her avatar. Minted luxury was a fun one. So minted luxury was a scenario in which we think, we included Web3 in this. So it was a scenario in which we think that NFTs, the real potential of those might not necessarily be with art. It might be on the secondary resale market. So companies that want to take a cut of your resale, like let's say that if we have a nice expensive product like Rolex, which can sometimes get a higher valuation in its resale. What if a company like Rolex were to say, well, let's make an NFT out of this, and let's see if we can get a cut when Josh sells the Rolex to me, which not going to happen. But if it does, if I'm buying a Rolex, Josh gets a cut of the sale, obviously, because he's the one selling it, but maybe Rolex also gets a cut of the sale. And this happened shortly after. It turned out that Pearson, which produces textbooks, wanted to do that. So they wanted to turn textbooks into an NFT so they could take a cut from students selling it to each other, which is probably like the worst company and example to kind of do this. But I think that we might be seeing this come up with actual luxury retailers like Louis Vuitton soon as well. I think there was some rumblings of this happening. And then finally, meta shamans, the idea that VR could potentially be used for transcendent experiences. We've seen a bit of that. There's lots of evidence for it, but there's evidence that came up after we published the report that VR is just as good at psychedelics at helping people reach transcendence. So we got some confirmation from our last report. So we're kind of a little bit gung-ho about this one. And we think that these potential emerging futures that are coming up could be things that potentially happen. They may or they may not, but we think there's value in exploring them regardless, and they have implications for stakeholders. Some of these scenarios that we have in the report are quite positive and things that you might want to pursue and might be desirable in the world. And some of them are negative you don't necessarily want. But the idea is to sort of play around with the construct and to think about what the implications are. And with this particular report, with simulating the future, because so many of the things that we put in portals came true, we had to actually push out further and think about what it would mean to go 10, 20 years down the road, as opposed to a few months, because things were happening so quickly. So the first one that I want to present here in simulating the future is virtual instruments. So what we kind of looked at was this idea that every instrument that has ever been created has been subject to gravity. And when you're in a virtual space or when you're in the metaverse, that doesn't necessarily have to be a complete hindrance. You know, we're still going to feel gravity because we're obviously, our bodies are in the real world. But objects in virtual spaces don't have to be subject to gravity. Those can be much more easily manipulated. So the music industry could transform when meta natives create virtual instruments, shapes, forms, and sounds that we haven't seen before in reality that are unique to virtual spaces. And that could include everything from, you know, very weird configurations to 3D, you know, instruments that float, to things like using your body as an instrument as well and embodying an instrument. Ideal state. So this is going in from, you know, entertainment moving to government. Essentially what we think could potentially happen is that cities like New York, Mumbai, and Tokyo might need to move to a different location. This is already happening. So the capital of Indonesia needs to move, Jakarta needs to move, and they're looking at a move for 2024. So, you know, this is probably going to be something that we're going to face as climate change gets worse. After we published this report, we learned that New York is sinking. So New York, as an example, is probably a good one to work with. But digital twin simulations of cities could help governments choose optimal locations for new cities. And we think that social twins might also help determine what it is that makes a city what it is, essentially. So, you know, is New York still New York without Broadway and the bodegas? And what's the configuration that you would need that would be ideal for citizens? What location would you move to? And how do you think through a very complex construct and potentially having to rebuild that? And this is partly possible now because we've got organizations, I believe that it's Carnegie Mellon and Fujitsu, that are looking at social digital twins. So not just mapping out digital twins in terms of objects, but the relationship between things. And then finally, we have simulated superfoods. So, you know, what if Billie Eilish decided to create broccoli? And have a Billie Eilish broccoli. But essentially, we would be using 3D simulations and synthetic biology to develop superfoods. And there's all sorts of implications for this. So you could have a celebrity that, you know, creates their own tailored superfood that they believe is better than any other food and gives them a boost when they're touring. You could have ultra wealthy creating optimized diets and personalized diets for themselves. You could see influencers create things like flavor graphs. So, you know, if I'm having a meal, the flavor profile might be something that I can capture and simulate and then share with others. And then nutritionists and dietitians might use digital twins to treat disorders and disease. So using food in a very strategic way, more so than we are now, in terms of creating preventative care and healthcare through food. So those are just 3 of the scenarios that are in the report. There are a total of 10, and we encourage you to take a look. And when we lay them out, we lay them out with the evidence, some of the evidence that we use to build these scenarios. And we also think about who the stakeholders are that could potentially be impacted by them. So I encourage you to grab a copy of it. And you can do so here. So the copy of the report is available at multiversedesign.com/metaverse-report. It's available for free. You don't have to pay for it. This is something that we put out into the world. Portals is also available if you want to go back and take a look at some of the stuff that's already come true and is coming true very slowly. But this is essentially a labor of love that we put out into the world. And if you have any questions or if you'd like custom work, the work that we've created and the scenarios that we've created are not designed for a particular company. They're not designed for to be used essentially, you know, to apply directly to you. Some of them might not. But if you want a custom work, you can always reach out to Jesse or I to do so. And thank you very much. That's all from me.
All right, Leah, that was awesome. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. All right, let's jump over to the Q&A. If anybody has any questions, throw it into the Q&A and I can certainly, we can pose them to Leah. I guess to start with, I'll start at the beginning, which is, we're very kind of like in that weird early stage right now where there's a lot of those weird false signals. And I guess one of the questions that I have is like, what are some of the signals that you actually think are worth exploring? Like, is it worth going to Decentraland? Is it, is it worth buying a Vision Pro? Like, what are the things that you think are actually probably worth kind of kicking the tires on?
Yeah, as a futurist, I'm actually a bit of a lagger in technology because I kind of like to see how everybody picks up on these things and how they use them. But in terms of the signals that I'm paying attention to, I'm not worried about a particular technology or particular company. I'm kind of looking at where the conversation is going as a whole, and I'm focusing on the people who I think are saying interesting things and are not contributing to the noise one way or the other. So partly when I look at somebody like Matthew Ball, for instance, I think Matthew is a legitimate expert in the space who is probably doing useful and serious work. And part of the reason why I think his work would stand out is because of the people who are reading it. So if you have the heads of billion-dollar companies reading a particular book and taking their cues from a particular space, it means that the rest of us need to do that as well. Because if we're not doing that, we're not on the same page. So I'm paying attention to things like that. I'm also paying attention to hacks and weird use cases that are coming up. So like that woman who's going to get plastic surgery because her avatar looks a certain way, that's a signal of something. We as human beings are not as symmetrical as we think we are. And seeing these hypersymmetrical versions of ourselves that are like particularly beautiful could potentially create weird conflicts for us that we haven't thought through yet. But it could also create like all sorts of new opportunities as well. So thinking through what some of those use cases could be is really important.
Yeah, I have a 6-year-old who collects LOL dolls, so that idea is terrifying, actually.
Right.
Like, I very much hope that she does not try to disfigure herself into looking like an LOL doll. Although there's actually some positive signals. It's probably better to look like that than a 1950s Barbie. I'm gonna ask a question from the Q&A. Daphne Peters asked, "Do you see AR or VR becoming more broadly used or adopted?"
I think so. I don't think it's going to happen next year by any means. I think it's going to take a little while longer. And I think, again, it depends on what those use cases are. If we can find those opportunities where it makes a lot of sense to switch to a 3D environment rather than having 2D, you have to kind of suss out like where that opportunity is. And so it might emerge in places like healthcare first before it comes into like workplaces. Like, are there a lot of advantages to, having the screens splayed out in front of you in a 3D environment? Maybe not, but doing immersive education. So one of the scenarios in the report is the value of like, let's not talk about Jurassic Park, let's go into Jurassic Park and study dinosaurs through that lens and like walk around in a simulation. So kind of like the magic school bus version of education. That could be super valuable, and it could open up all sorts of opportunities for learning. So again, looking at those use cases is where we're going to be marking whether or not the technology is going to go mainstream. The other thing that I always hear, and it's a little bit strange to hear people say, is like, oh my God, the Oculus is so much money, and like, why would anyone buy this? And I'm just thinking, like, think about how much your cell phone costs. I'm pretty sure you're not giving up your cell phone anytime soon. Like, it would be very hard to convince people, like, put your mobile phones away, and never have one again. Like, very few people would be willing to give that up. And a lot of people upgrade every 2 years, and these things are expensive. So again, like, it's really right now stuck in the entertainment device mode. If it can move out of that for people, that's when we're going to start to see pick up on sales.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I was thinking about sort of like the affordances of like different technologies and also even just like the native file types, so it's like, this, computer screen or whatever, it's flat. So most of the assets are flat assets. There's lots of like JPEGs and GIFs and text, everything is very two-dimensional because it is two-dimensional. But it's like, the future, when you can have 3D assets and you can kind of move around them and you can explore them, it opens up all sorts of different possibilities. And it's, I think if you take that the the example of medical. If you're a surgeon and you want to, you're looking at a heart, it's probably better to be able to move it and manipulate it, see it from all different angles, zoom in, do all those sort of things, than look at a bunch of, sequence of stills. And I think you're 100% right that as these devices come online, you're going to see people kind of like figuring out like, oh, this is actually useful. And I think it's the useful stuff that'll probably dictate the future. I mean, and I think you're pointing to that for sure.
Yeah, when I think of mobile, 15 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I'm like forgetting how old I am now. About 15 years ago, if I went to a city, you would have used a map to get around. Like when I went to Paris, I had to get a map of the metro and walk around and physically place myself. And you would see maps everywhere. That's not the case anymore because mobile changed that, right? Like I can now navigate the city. I can see what restaurants are there along the way, and I can find out what other people said about those restaurants as I go, which is not something a 2D map would have ever allowed me to do. And that's like one of the main affordances of mobile that desktop just can't give you. And so that switch from, desktop to mobile is analogous to a switch from mobile to 3D. And you have to remember that for a lot of people around the world, mobile is their primary access to the internet. They don't have access to desktop. They don't have access to the infrastructure that allows for desktop. And so they're mobile only and they're mobile first, which then asks, begs the question, like what percentage of the population might be 3D first or immersive first? And given the scope of all of this, there's still, half the world's population that isn't on the internet at all. So we already have a digital or internet apartheid scenario going. It's likely that there's going to be less and less of the population that's adopting these new methods. But again, what are the opportunities that are available to them when they do, or if they do? And what are other people out on because they can't?
Totally. I spent a lot of time looking at like what's happening like the Middle East and Dubai. Or like Saudi, or like those Saudi giga cities, because you see, when you talk about this idea of like moving cities and simulating and thinking what's new and next, like they're, those Saudi giga projects, like they're building brand new cities from the ground up, and with all these like new technological affordances. So you're like, oh, okay, well, what does that actually look like? Like do you need maps? Do you need signs if everything's really gonna, if the technology can be really thought of in that sort of ground up way?
Yeah, exactly.
You probably do, honestly. Okay, so that's all right. So Phil has a question. Phil Layville. If you didn't cover it before I jumped in, I was late. Can you generally describe or characterize the organizations and/or people you interview to develop your future concepts?
Yeah, so we don't really do the process of interviewing people in organizations because it's like the Ford quote, if you ask people what they want, they'll say a better horse. And so when you do foresight work, you can sometimes speak to edge users and people who are kind of operating in a way that's like more futuristic or like more aligned with future states rather than present states. But what we essentially do is that we look for fringe data. So we look at like, what are the cases, like really unique incidences of things that are happening in the world. Some of that evidence, again, is presented in the report. And then we think through like, if this were to scale and, meet with other larger forces that are happening in the world, like AI, like climate change, like movements towards nationalism, the offset of democracy, those things. How would that confluence sort of play out? And we kind of look at the evidence and what can scale and what maybe might scale, and then filter from there. So when you look at the report, you'll see just like our top 3 pieces of evidence that are pointing in a particular direction. It's actually a lot more than that. For brevity's sake, we haven't included everything just because people don't want to see pages and pages of like, here's all the things you considered behind this, like half a page scenario. But really there's a lot of work that goes into kind of almost triangulating and figuring out what are the pieces that are going to fit together and how are those pieces going to look when they move into the future.
Okay, so I have a question that's probably a fairly selfish one. Okay, if I wanted to be sort of an armchair futurist and look for those signals, how do I do it?
So signals can be found anywhere. And signals are not the only thing that you would consider. Like we actually consider 3 different types of data points. So signals are one, which are the unique weird incidences. The next one is trends. Everybody's kind of familiar with those. That's like the, 53% of people think this. And then the next one, which I think are more important than trends, are forces, driving forces. And these are the things that are happening in the world that are like really difficult to derail because they're like just these massive moving things that are shifting every aspect of society. So again, AI is one of those things. Climate change is one of those things where we'll see effects across all systems and potentially, things that could significantly change how humanity goes forward. And so what we want to do is we want to take those signals and we want to drop them against those forces and see how they play out. So if you want to look for signals, places to do that are things like academic journals, which focus on research, right? So things that are not yet technologies, but are theoretical and are being thought about in very small circles. You can look at conversations and things that are happening on Twitter. Sometimes somebody will drop like a weird instance or use case, and we pay attention to it. A conversation isn't necessarily a strong signal. It's what we would call a weak signal. But when people start saying things, and many people start saying them, then you really have to start paying attention, like something weird is going on here. Another good example of where to look, you can just literally do Google searches, and you have to be careful. This is like where the art of Boolean searches and really what's going on with Midjourney and ChatGPT is going on. The better you get at wording something, the better you get at getting weird results. So you want to look for edge cases. You want to look at companies that are like small in like really early stages that are like looking at hypothetical technologies. Not all of them are going to pan out, obviously, but they could be interesting. Databases like TechCrunch could be interesting as well, because then you see who's getting funding and who's kind of like putting themselves out there for like Series A funding. And so when these organizations are doing stuff, it's really interesting. The other thing that I look for is like patents. So when patents emerge and a company is filing for something, that can indicate that they've got something in the works, and that could come up down the line. So
Okay, I love it.
examples like that.
Yeah, I those are great. The one other one that I would add in there, which I think you kind of mentioned, is like any of these like venture funds. I always look at like early seed stage venture funds. I always look at who they're funding, because like those are like, particularly if it's like pre-seed, and there's a reputable fund, you can find some really interesting things there. Probably also lots of false signals, but what are you gonna do? Okay, so Michael, Libby had a question. So focusing on entertainment, how do you see this tech disrupting the classic Hollywood model? How fast do you see it happening? And how receptive are studios to experimenting in the space?
Yeah, I mean, it's already kind of happening. And it's one of the concerns that's coming up around the writer's strike, right? You see actors who are kind of rushing to capture 3D versions of themselves because now AI is allowing them to basically film things without ever being present, because your likeness and your voice can be simulated. So that is essentially a simulation. It is kind of a use case of the metaverse that's emerging. It's just being labeled as AI because we forget that the metaverse is a confluence of technologies. So we're seeing that already. There is a particular scenario in the report that deals specifically with entertainment, and it's really kind of going into the far future scenario, which is looking at strategic LARPing. And strategic LARPing is the idea of using spaces like the Volume and inviting fans in to play around in particular worlds. So if I'm, Marvel, and I want to think about what the next storyline could be, why not bring the fans in and let them play? You can embody different superheroes. You can create your own one. You can play along with the storyline or a plot line that they've set up. You can invent your own. And we think that there's a potential to allow people to use the spaces that have already been built like that, and for the studios to then capture that information and that data and convert it into storylines that they could potentially create into things that they put out into the world. And it's an interesting thing that could potentially happen given the kinds of technologies that we've already seen. So the uses of volumes, the uses of like mixed theater. So having these elaborate visual displays that create a level of immersion that's happening in the background. So there was one that was created for the Bourne Identity, I think, where like you've got the motorcycle sitting on stage pretending to go, and it's the screens in the background are showing that it's rushing past. And so you get an immersive experience that's being created in that way. So there's some weird opportunities that could potentially come up.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I love it. I love it. I love the idea of strategic LARPing. For anybody who doesn't know the acronym LARP, it's live action role play. No. It's so funny because it's like, I always think about, I like collected like comic books in like the 90s, and it was like nobody liked those things, and like now it's so mainstream. And it was like kind of like pseudo nerd. It was totally nerdy back then. And now it's like everyone like is into Thor, Chris Hemsworth, right. And then it's like you always want to see like what are the weird kids doing, and it's like I feel like LARPing is probably a very early signal of a type of behavior that will probably go mainstream. And I love this idea of being able to try on new identities and people experimenting with the self and simulating the self. I think that's a really exciting opportunity. Cool. All right. So let me see let's grab another one. Do you see the convergence? This is from Courtney Fallow. Do you see a convergence of gaming culture, design, and technology with traditional business operations and strategies? If so, what are those early signals?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where we kind of, not look at Fortnite, but look at the technology underlying Fortnite. So will there be opportunities that involve, things like virtual worlds and going into them? Absolutely. One of the scenarios that we've laid out is open world science. So we think that there's a really good opportunity for scientists and researchers to partner with gaming companies and to create opportunities and experiments within gaming worlds. So we took that from World of Warcraft. There was an incident a few years ago called the Corrupted Blood incident, which was essentially a glitch that happened in World of Warcraft, which is a I'm forgetting I'm forgetting what it means. It's an online role-playing game.
Massive multiplayer game.
Yes, that's it. You've got the other
MMORPG. Yeah.
Yes, you've got it. So the online role-playing game essentially, and it's an open world, and the glitch in the system created conditions that were very similar to a pandemic. And so all of a sudden you had a scenario where people were running around infecting each other. Other people were running around and healing each other and doing all sorts of weird things. And it created a wealth of information for epidemiologists, because when do you get to study behaviors during a pandemic? Only during a pandemic. And this happened a few years before the pandemic happened, the actual one. In the real world. But yeah, it gave researchers a ton of insights into how an epidemic could potentially work, what the sort of behaviors might emerge are, and what they need to consider strategically in terms of response. So why not do that again? Yeah. Why not strategically do that again, where maybe there's a special event on Fortnite that you integrate gameplay with a scientific experiment. How might something like Grand Theft Auto be used to understand the impacts of climate change, like what happens when water moves into a city. So there's opportunities that we can potentially look at there. But again, we want to think about not necessarily how Fortnite gets used by companies. We want to think about the application of real-time rendering. So if you think back to the firefighting example, that's a really good example of something using real-time rendering in a very, very useful way, using game technology for a real world application. And so those opportunities exist across many fields. We need to explore what they are.
Yeah, it's so funny. I went to the AWE conference, and there's like all the different metaverses talking, and all these people talking about the metaverse, and there's like there were all those like NFT and metaverses that were getting all this like crazy funding. And then there was like Roblox and Fortnite, and the number of users in those spaces is like unbelievable. And I have a 10-year-old son, and like that kid spends a hell of a lot of time in Roblox. And it's like, in some ways I'm like, oh, like, is this already the metaverse? Is that already like what's happening? Like he's playing with his friends, like all over the country. It's really wild.
Yeah, and there's potential to use those platforms in ways that we aren't using them right now that could
Totally.
potentially be beneficial for different uses. And so thinking about how those interactions might happen is some of the things that we need to do, and we're probably not thinking about enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting too, because it's like, a lot of it is, when you're trying to like educate children, or you're trying to like, educate anybody, you want to like basically work with the norms and the things that they like, like, it's like, and it makes so much sense that you would be using those platforms that they actually opt into, rather than like forcing them into these like old modes of content, which, I mean, honestly, I'm trying desperately to get my child to read actual books, but like, I do think that like if I were trying, if I actually cared about the outcome and like him learning specific things, like I probably, I would be looking to those places like Roblox, for that to happen.
Yeah, and there's a lot of efficacy now to support that because these things have been around for a while and the research is being done. So, for instance, we know that if you take, for instance, engineering students and put them into an avatar where they see themselves as like an innovator or as a creative person,
Mhm.
like if I make you embody Lizzo or embody Einstein, how you see yourself changes. You come out of that,
Oh, I love it.
reporting, seeing yourself as a more creative person or a more innovative person. There's there, I think this was in Decentraland. There was an MLK Jr. Experience that allowed people to learn. And the retention and the engagement on that was much higher than you would see in like a video or like regular school learning or school material. So the fact that we have that information, we know the effectiveness already. That's kind of what we should be incorporating into some of these other spaces when we're thinking about how we're helping like kids learn or how we're helping adults learn or like what some of those other applications are.
Yeah, and I think what's actually really interesting too, that sometimes gets overlooked in the conversation around metaverse, is that they are like they're communal. Like, you're engaging with people in real time, and like in some ways this is also like a communal space. We're having a
Mhm.
conversation in real time, and so much of this other stuff was like asynchronous. Is like,
Right.
even social is very asynchronous. It's like, and I think there's something really interesting about when you can have people together at the same time. Well, then they can like co-create, they can have conversation. Like it's more generative than some of the older modes.
Yeah, and removing sort of the factor of distance, not
Mhm.
always time, but distance, and being able to like manipulate objects or pass things around or do things like that with each other, which you kind of can't do. It's really hard to do in a 2D space. Like
Totally.
I couldn't take this and hand it to you. You're not
Yeah.
going to get it through this format. But if we're in a virtual space with virtual objects, we could do things like that. And so, what sort of affordances does that allow?
Yeah. One of the things I'd love to do is it's sort of a shout back to like SDGD. So this is SDGD, like it's the Society of Experiential Graphic Design. And, it's really thinking, it's a lot of architects, people who are designing, technologies, or even just like environments and physical spaces, like signage, like just really thinking about how like the physical environment gets designed. And I love this idea that you had spoken to about like simulating futures, and like, and I know that a lot of like architecture firms and even like a Blue Cadet, we spend a lot of time doing like previs in these like in VR and stuff like that. But I think I would love for you to think about like, how that community and like those types of people could benefit from some of the tools that are out there, how they could be thinking about taking advantage of this for their own craft.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what you're doing, but thinking about what the next generation of tools are going to look like, what the next generation of needs are going to look like, I think the easiest place to start is to think about what sort of challenges in the world that you want to tackle, and what those look like and where the intersection of this technology and that could be. So, for instance, if you are a graphic designer and you're looking to create new visual worlds in these spaces, and you really want to think about like what people embody, the intersection of that and mental health is probably really
Yeah.
crucial. The intersection of that versus, climate change, what happens when the world physically deteriorates more, and what do these virtual spaces allow that reality will no longer allow. So thinking through things like that will be important. Architecture, there's lots of room for improvement, and like this is what I mean when I talk about like putting signals in the context of driving forces. I want to think about how architecture, the metaverse, and things like new materials and new synthetic biology materials might intersect with each other. So what kind of shapes might we create that are more climate friendly and nature friendly? What sort of environments would those be? If we want to bring AI into those mix, what do those materials look like? Can we generate new lists of materials, new biological materials that might be again, better for the environment, and how would those work? And so that experimentation, I think, is going to be key, and thinking about how these different things come together is probably going to be key.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's also, we've started kind of playing with, that sort of architectural previs, where, if we're going to do something like, okay, put some giant screen somewhere, or like make some different spatial moves, or like even when you're talking about like laying out an art museum, like how does content flow? These are all places where you can like rapidly prototype. And then what's really interesting too is there were all these tools that we would use to like visualize, like visitor journey or people in the flow, or like state, like the density of crowd states and how that would affect an experience. And it was always like this idea that you would see it on a screen, and you have your little grasshopper algorithm, and you see all these people flowing. But to be able to actually like put on a thing and see that, it's like the difference between looking at like Google Maps, and then having to interpret your environment, to like having this stuff integrated into the environment. I think it's just much more powerful, much more direct.
Yeah, and if I were to layer on like a level onto that, one thing that you might not be able to capture in 2D is audio. So if you
Totally.
add more people into a space, what does that do to ambient noise?
Mhm.
And how does that then, change the experience? So you could potentially experiment with things that are really hard to experiment with right now. And we had this in one of the scenarios in the report. But it kind of acts like a time machine. Like the way that I think about a metaverse space isn't like Ready Player One, or like, Snow Crash, like where, yes, the idea and the concept have emerged out of and the word was coined. But if I were to think about the ideal sort of construct, it would be more like the holodeck in Star Trek.
Oh
So it'd
yeah.
be like this space where you could enter that could kind of become anything. And if I were to think about like one of the ideal spaces to put that, it would be like a museum or a library where people have access to it. And it sort of becomes this communal space where it's flexible. It can do a lot of different things. You can, play, you can learn. There would be probably some weird things happening in there
Yeah.
too that we
Yeah.
maybe want to discourage. But there's lots of opportunities with that. And so thinking about like different metaphors and different sort of, again, affordances, different things that we can't currently do in reality, that's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. Like, where are the limitations in reality that are hard to overcome, and what can we do in these spaces that we can't do in the physical world?
Yeah. And I think, I totally agree that like it's so funny because like a lot of people for like years have been asking us to like build the holodeck, and I'm like, that's not possible. You can't really do it.
Yeah.
And like now I'm like, I think I can kind of do it for you. It's gonna be VR. It's gonna look, or it's gonna be like these like immersive sound stages. It's beginning, like those tools are starting to get very close. But I think it's very interesting to really track the affordances, like what are the problems that you can solve, and like what are the experiences that you can give people with these new tools now. And I think it's probably, well, no one is really that great at predicting the future, so we'll sort of see where I think these things take off. So I think we only have like 5 minutes left. Are there any other kind of like, big things or big takeaways you'd kind of like want to leave with this group, or, like if they wanted to kind of like get started or get involved or sort of follow the wormhole, obviously download the report. But what are some other things you might suggest?
Give it time. This is a long arc. So it's going to require some patience. I think the other big sort of takeaway that we took out of doing this work is that when you show people actual use cases and you don't use the word metaverse, they're all for it. It's a
Yeah.
weird sort of thing that's happening where like the second the word metaverse is used, it's like, no, we don't want this. This thing is a joke. This isn't real. This is dead. And then when we switch to like, let's not use the word metaverse like at all. Let's talk about what we actually want to do. So things like the born identity experience, things like the XR AI glasses, or things like the firefighting using metaverse technologies. There's almost like a unanimous yes, like, oh my God, of course we would want that. Why wouldn't we want that. This is amazing.
Yeah.
And so that conversation, like you really got to pay attention to like what's being said around the word versus the actual thing that's happening.
Totally.
And pay attention to like how language is going to change around this, because it might just be like, we never call this thing metaverse. We will likely shift to another term because the word has kind of been polluted and bogged down a bit. We might use, 3D internet, we might use spatial, we might use immersive internet. So pay attention to some of those other words that are now starting to bubble up that reflect what the technology is, that reflect what we're aiming for with the metaverse, but not using that term.
Yeah. Oh man, Zuckerberg killed it. And then, yeah, FTX killed NFT as well. So
Yeah, exactly.
we need a totally new glossary. Leah, thank you so much. This was a fascinating presentation, amazing conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, and really
Absolutely.
enjoyed this session.
All right, I'll pass it back to Sibel.
Thank you. This was phenomenal, Leah. And there was some comments about, I see so much potential for our field of practice, how we can test things with, real humans, content and experiences. And so it's very exciting. And we know that some things are way out, but some things I think we can begin to activate in our practice, as the technology becomes available. So if you enjoy these conversations and you want to be a part of this community, join us at SCGD. We'd love to have you. This is a QR code. You can save off your annual renewal membership, and we have something going on for the month of July because we're turning 50, so you can save $50 if you're already a member. Thank you, Josh, for continuing these compelling conversations that are pushing us out of our comfort zone maybe, and open to exploring new ways of thinking and doing in our practices, and also just in the world at large. And really amazing research and work, Leah. So thank you. And we will definitely be tracking you. And we'll share also your Metaverse report on our website. So thanks everyone. And we look forward to seeing you soon with our next webinar. Thanks, Josh.